is Erin Payton. I'm the Executive Director of the 19th Century Charitable Association, located in Oak Park, Illinois. We have a wonderful program for you tonight called Notable Neighbors. Jesse Driscoll with Brian Flora. Before I introduce Al Parcham, I'm going to let you know that at the end of this program, if you have a question for either Jesse or Brian, you can ask it yourself. You can leave the question either in our Q&A field or in our comment section, and I will unmute you and call you out and ask you to ask the question yourself. So be ready for that and think of some great questions for these two wonderful gentlemen. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to bring on Al Parcham. Hi, Al.
Hi, Erin. Hello, everyone. I'm Al Parcham. I'm the president of the 19th Century Charitable Association, and I am happy to introduce this Notable Neighbors series. Let me give you a little bit of logic about it. I've been a 40-year resident of Oak Park River Forest area, and in that time, I've met many, many very interesting people. And it's always occurred to me that, well, somebody ought to know, some other people ought to know about this person and what they're doing. And in thinking about that some more, I decided that maybe we could do a series called Notable Neighbors. So that's the logic of this. And it's really an interview / conversation with people who are doing interesting things, and we think, or you think, others ought to hear about them. And I say you think because it would be great if people who are watching this and get the idea nominate themselves or others to take part in the Notable Neighbors series. We're going to be doing three different sessions this fall, in now in September, one in October and one in November. We'll be doing one on October 22nd and another on November 12th. And I can promise you that those are very, very interesting people. We're going to take a break then, see what the reaction has been to the series, and see if some people, we've got some other people in the pipeline, but we're hoping that this will really catch on with the audience and they'll recommend other folks. Tonight's, this session tonight is with Jesse Driscoll and Brian Flora. And Brian will introduce Jesse, but I will just say this about him. He had a longer commute than most of us ever had going to their job. And I like to say that we're very, very, very lucky to have Brian Flora, a 35-year career diplomat for the US, to be doing the interviewing. And all I can tell you is when I introduced Brian and Jesse, I could tell after 10 minutes that they knew the world in a way that I had no idea about. And I just sat back and listened, and it was a fascinating afternoon. So without further ado, Brian, take over here. Welcome, Jesse.
Hello, everybody. My name, as we have said, is Brian Flora, a career diplomat, and I was fascinated by our conversation with Professor Jesse Driscoll. He's Al Parcham's Oak Park neighbor and an international relations professor. He was born in Moscow. That's Idaho, not Russia. He did his elementary education in Saudi Arabia, but moved back to the United States during the first Gulf War and finished high school in Spokane, Washington. He received his bachelor degree in international relations and a master's in security studies from the prestigious Georgetown School of Foreign Service in Washington, D.C. Professor Driscoll went on to get his doctorate in political science and international relations at Stanford University and began a successful academic career at the University of California, San Diego, where he teaches at the School for Global Policy and Strategy. Many of his students are actually active duty or recently retired military personnel. His substantive classes focus on topics relevant to international security, particularly, and this is a little bit down in the weeds, as regards the countries that were former Soviet socialist republics in the Eurasian portion of the Soviet Union. He now lives in Oak Park with his wife Emma and their two small children, commutes to California to teach, at least he did before the pandemic, and his friends in Oak Park call him Jesse. So Jesse, when and how did the family wind up in Oak Park, and what keeps you here?
Well, the easy answer is my wife's career and very good luck in interaction. We met, my wife and I, when she was living in Ukrainian Village, and I had just gotten a job in California. We weren't married at the time, and the proposition for me was something like, well, if you want to make this work, I have to go take that job in California. How do you feel about passing the California bar? And she did. And 10 years later, when I had tenure, kind of unusual labor protections that come with that, she flipped it on me and asked me to explore commuting options. And that's what I've done. And she has just been completely right about the move. We love it here. She likes taking the L. I really like the farmers market. Our kids love the Park District. This is just a wonderful neighborhood, and we particularly like our block, I have to say. We just feel immensely lucky to have landed where we did. So,
Thank you. I sort of feel the same way about Oak Park. We wound up here by mistake and intended to move away, but it's been 13 years now, so we're staying. Now, you've done lots of research in obscure ex-Soviet Eurasian countries whose names most Americans can't even pronounce. The results were published in your first book, entitled Warlords and Coalition Politics in Post-Soviet States. Now, without going too far down the weeds, in a nutshell, what were your principal conclusions and findings?
Well, in a nutshell, I describe in the book that sometimes you can have peace without real disarmament in a civil war. Even when you have a really ugly civil war situation, sometimes it does end without disarmament by any of the principal actors, and instead just a lot of side switching by factions as different armed groups. I focus on the leaders of these armed groups. I call them warlords. It's kind of a pejorative term. A lot of these warlords switch sides and eventually become the state. They shave their beards and put on uniforms and become, at first, indistinguishable from state agents, and then they become actual state agents. And so this is a different approach than the dominant field approach by practitioners of international relations informed by academic articles. They kind of assume that at the end of a civil war, you have to have the losers put their guns away. And then the dominant approach goes further and say that there's a difficulty in settling the war because people can anticipate that after they don't have weapons, they're going to be at risk of being taken advantage of. And then the idea is that if you can get a good UN mission in there, they're going to feel safe disarmed. So sometimes, however, geography dictates that when the UN shows up, it's not going to be Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. The UN is going to show up and it's going to be the Russian military. And so under those circumstances, you can anticipate that they won't be neutral, and therefore you shouldn't disarm. So no one disarms, and then how does the war actually end? That was the sharp edge of the question that I used to motivate myself to go to these parts of the world. And you know, again, you'd have to read the book, but the short answer is that you do have locals kind of working it out in the shadow of Russian power, in the shadow of US funded aid community. People do manage to find their way to peaceful resolutions, even when the UN as a third party is not really a trusted neutral actor. And I spent a lot of time in Tajikistan talking to Tajiks. I spent a lot of time in Georgia talking to Georgians, and you know, since then I've had the good fortune to go to some other places too. But that was how I got started. I guess in a nutshell, the other thing that I found, and this is maybe more personal, is that I found I found that a lot of my presuppositions, I guess, before I went to the field were wrong. And one of the most important of them was that I learned that researchers are not automatically trusted by their subjects. And I thought maybe I would be the exception to that because I'm so charming or something. And it turns out that if you go to Tajikistan and you go to Georgia and you ask a lot of people about these wars, even if you're very careful about how you do it and you spend a lot of time working on it so that people can trust you, it turns out that people will still lie, either because they see you as a conduit to something, aid or a job or a visa, or just because they say what they think they're expected to say to be a good nationalist. And I also learned that sometimes people are afraid of us when we ask these kinds of questions. They come to assume that the only reason you would ask them is because you are targeting drones or something. And so that was, I have to admit, I was embarrassed at how flat-footed I was when I was caught in the headlights of some of those interactions. And I eventually worked my way around them, but the fact that I was caught so flat-footed meant I must have been learning something, or I wouldn't have been so surprised.
Did you deal much with opposition politicians?
Not much in Georgia, I have to say, because of the timing of when I was there. The opposition had kind of taken over the state. They called it the Rose Revolution. And so it was a funny moment in time when the opposition was not a really meaningful social construct. I talked to a lot of folks who could remember being in power, but then had been purged at one point or another in the 1990s and felt that they had been done wrong by the old government, by Shevardnadze. But they had tales to tell, but that's not quite the same thing as dealing with opposition politicians. In Tajikistan, I must say, I did deal with some of the people who I think we would still think of as the opposition, Islamic fundamentalist types, people who had a set of grievances that put them well outside the normal, spectrum of politics in Tajikistan, but in a way that is recognizably opposition politics. I don't want to exaggerate the ties that I had to those people, but I did talk to some of them. But it was never, to reiterate the point, it was never a research design aimed at going in and talking to political elites that were trying to change things in the legislature or organize votes or anything like that. I was basically talking to violence entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm. And do they have in Tajikistan and Republic of Georgia, do they have sort of the business tycoons, the oligarchs like they have in Russia? Is there anything similar?
They sure do. And I didn't really get to know any of them. I wish I had romantic stories to tell about shady dealings with fast cars or anything like that.
Caviar and champagne and... No,
that I was on a different part of the economic distribution. I was out in a village called Kalehum, not the kind of place that oligarchs slow their cars down.
What about U.S. embassy officials and diplomats? Did you talk to foreign diplomats, embassy officials?
Yes, and that ended up being really critical to my research because it gave me the insight that, particularly in Tajikistan, but the insight extended to other places as well, but particularly in Tajikistan, if you just look at the sociology of the capital city, you can see that the foreign-funded embassy culture and all of the associated NGOs that are associated with it are really the only game in town when it comes to pulling down a European salary. Like the best way to pull down a European salary in Dushanbe is to be drawing a European salary from a European government and be stationed in Tajikistan. And so you have an entire secondary economy that is based around getting their hands in the pockets somehow of the Europeans. as security guards, as hotel owners, as people who run the restaurants that those people shop in, and that sort of thing. And so I had the insight that when it came time to settle the Civil War, the rents that come from reaching into the pockets of the foreign donor community that is doing all of the peace and reconciliation stuff, as well as running embassies, that's what provided the lure that could convince warlords to switch sides. It's like, if you come down out of the mountains, I don't know what you're doing up there. I think you're selling drugs or something and claiming that you care about jihad or something. Anyway, let me offer you a deal. You can have this wing of the hotel. You can put your mother-in-law in a room, and then you're going to draw an income stream, and you'll make way more money doing that than you could possibly make up in the mountains. And that sounds like pretty banal stuff, but it turns out that ended up being very important to the settlement process. And so, at least the way that I tell the story, I mean, there are a lot of different facets to it. But just to say something briefly as well that's different about Georgia. Georgia is a place where there's a huge network of social scientists doing research that are associated with embassies. The Caucasus Research Resource Centers allowed me to get in touch with German academics, British academics, just a huge milieu of people who are interested in running representative surveys and essentially teaching sociology classes pro bono to Armenians and Azeris. And I've just found the entire thing so inspiring, and it was great. So that was a different facet of my life there, but it made my time in Georgia
sounds like you had a very interesting time.
I did.
But let's change gears a little bit, because your most recent book, which I now understand is in the editing stage, deals with contemporary Ukraine, a much more important actor in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody knows that 5 years ago, Russia invaded the Ukrainian Crimea and annexed it, and even began providing strong support, including military weapons and military volunteers to Ukrainian separatists in the eastern part of the country. Now, some have called this a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and others view it more as a Ukrainian civil war. Basically, would you describe the dynamics of the conflict? Was it an invasion of Russia, or was it a civil war? Is it both? Beyond the annexation of Crimea, what are Russia's objectives with respect to Ukraine?
Well, I think in order to answer the question, I'm going to indulge myself and maybe entertain the audience with a map or two. So let me try to answer your questions in order. Russia used to have a sphere of influence, analogous, I think, to the sphere of influence that the United States has in the Western Hemisphere. We have these big moats in the form of these oceans that kind of keep other countries from banging into us. And Russia didn't, because of it's a Eurasian empire, didn't have that. In order to get security from its primary security threat, which it defines as Western Europe. That's how Russia keeps getting invaded from Western Europe. They got invaded by Napoleon and then by the Nazis. So they have when Russians and the Soviet defense planners were thinking about defense, they were doing it using 19th century spheres of influence concepts, and defense in depth involved influence over countries that have subsequently got independent. And Ukraine is one of those countries. So, I think part of what they want out of Ukraine is a kind of a neutral buffer zone that keeps keeps some distance between the war games that are played by Western powers and its defensive structure. So that's one thing that it would like. Another thing that it would like, and I think this is often lost in the conversation, is they actually believe that they have responsibility to shape the politics within Ukraine because they see Ukraine as a cultural outpost of what is naturally their homeland and their motherland. So this is disputed, of course, by many Ukrainians, and I certainly don't want to give the impression that I believe everything that I'm about to say, but if you try to see it from the perspective of some Russians, they would tell the story like this. So this is a map of the Soviet Union. Right? This is from the what a lot of people think of as the battle days, and there are also, I must say, some people who feel nostalgia for this map, and that you understand Putinism better if you understand the nostalgia that people feel for it. But one of the things that the Soviet Union was good at doing is distinguishing between different ethnic groups, and they were very good at running censuses where you had to declare which ethnic group you were. So just eyeballing this map, you can see the stands down there. You can see Turkmenistan is darker green than Kazakhstan, which is the lighter green. So when the Soviet Union broke up, it led to a situation where you had a lot of people who thought of themselves as Russians, in their heart as Russians, that were living in a place that they thought of as home, but that was no longer within the borders of the Soviet Union. And so during the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was terrible violence in a couple of places, like Tajikistan, like Georgia, the places that I did my research that I talked about before. But it's remarkable really how peaceful it was. Of all the places, if you just look at this map, if you look at all of the different ethnic groups that might have started fighting with one another, very few of them did. And in the places where, well, let me just cut to the chase. Russians were never really targeted for violence. Like you don't find very many instances of Russians being targeted qua Russians anywhere. And I think part of that is, because of deterrence, that people worried that if they messed around with the Russians, that would be bad. And part of it is because it's hard to know who's who. Anyway, if you zoom in on this map, you let your eyes drift to the left side of the map, and I'll zoom us in here. You can see that Crimea is pink, so that means that this map only shows the dominant ethnic group in an area. It doesn't show any of the many minorities that existed in the Soviet Union. There's no color for gypsies, no color for Jews, despite the fact that there are many of them. But there is a color for Russians, and there were a lot of Russians in this place called Crimea. So that just means that in 1989, the plurality of people living there, according to the last Soviet census, were self-described Russian. There's an important warm water military base there. And I think the other thing to just keep in mind is that the hard distinction between pink and orange on this map is a bit of a misnomer. There are a lot of Russians who would deny that Ukrainian is really that distinct from Russians. Like if you go back through Russian history and you try to make a list of the really important cities to the history of the Russian people, and the list of the cities, the city-states that in a pre-nationalist era are core to Russian identity as the Rus, Kiev is just right up there. It's a really very old historical linkage. And so Ukrainians get apoplectic at the claim that they're really just Russians. Ukrainians will say we have spent hundreds of years distinguishing ourselves culturally from Russians. And again, I don't want to wade into that debate. All I want to say is that Russians are not inclined to make the claim that they are culturally indistinct from Uzbeks, or that they are culturally indistinct from Kazakhs or Tajiks. That's not a claim that Russians bother making. So there's a sense in which Ukraine, Ukrainians, they're really like us. They're really Russians. This is a piece of art from my house. It's got Father Russia, and little Ukraine is a girl. Father Russia is actually, he says, we're voting for peace and for brotherhood between the people, and he's actually voting for Ukraine. He's got 2 ballots in his hand and he's voting for it. So it's kind of, it's an ironic piece of art. Anyway, Flip the map, advance 12 years. The last really good census data we have from Ukraine is from 2001. And it's pretty clear that as of 2001, you have a split in Ukraine between the parts of Ukraine where lots of people are still identifying themselves as Russians. This is not Russian speaking, by the way. This is people who on a census will look in the eyes of a census enumerator and say, I am Russian. In Crimea, it's like 60%. In some of the eastern provinces, it's close to 40%. In some of the western provinces, it's much less than 5%. It's very, very low, social identification with Russian over in the West. And this is a big cleavage that runs through Ukrainian politics. In 1994, and then again in 2004, and then again in 2010, presidential contests were decided in runoffs between a candidate that represented all 9 of the kind of blue oblasts with large Russian-speaking populations. An oblast means a state or province. Sorry, but basically, you had one candidate that would get the whole East and one candidate that would get the whole West, and that would be the kind of defining cleavage in the country. And then today, one last map, you've got something different. So you have Crimea, which broke away. Russians tell the story that it was a moment of self-determination where they voted quickly and basically peacefully to exit a polity that had been taken over by vengeful Ukrainian fascists or something. And most Ukrainians say that wasn't a military takeover by fascists. That's what we call the revolution of dignity. That's when we threw out an evil, corrupt government, and that was not following the will of the people and was trying to bind the future of Ukraine to Russia with international treaties that we didn't want any part of. We, the people of Ukraine, didn't want any part of. And Crimea was a military occupation and an invasion. And those two narratives don't have very much in common, and they're not close to reconverging. So this is, Crimea's disputed territory right now. Russia claims that it's over, it's done, it's part of Russia. That's not recognized by Ukraine. It's also not recognized by the United States government. It's not recognized by most of the NATO countries, and every U.S. head of state says the exact same thing, which is we will never recognize the annexation of Crimea. Clear violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. So you have a different thing, however, going on in the Far East, the Donbass, and this is where you have a lot of tragic death. The numbers are disputed, but more than 10,000 people have died, well more than 10,000 people have died in a slow, grinding secessionist war by people east of that dotted line in the Donbass who wish that they were part of Russia and continue voting to join Russia, but Russia has not accepted them. So they're kind of trapped in the middle, like geopolitical pawns. And the details of how we got here could really absorb a much longer lecture, and I certainly don't want to burden everyone's time with those details. But suffice to say that in 2014, the map changed. And every time international relations theory teaches us that the interstate borders are not randomly assigned. Every time maps change, you should expect violence. And there has been a great deal of violence in this case. So I think about it as a civil war. I'm being long-winded to answer your question, but I do think it's useful to think about it as a civil war and an invasion. I think it's both. But I do think that calling it a civil war is probably the right way to start a conversation if we're interested in conflict resolution with Russia as a partner. There are a lot of other ways to talk about it. There's other ways to tell the story. But if what we're interested in doing is having a conversation with Russia, starting the conversation by making an analogy to the Anschluss is not the best way to start the conversation. So when I use the language of civil war, I'm being precise about my language as a social scientist, but I'm not trying to be provocative. I actually think that it draws attention to certain conflict dynamics that are going to necessarily be part of the settlement. So that's why I choose that language. I'm not trying to be a troll or to provoke my Ukrainian neighbors or anything like that. So okay, I'll take the maps down. I'm sorry to give such a lengthy response, but that.
Okay, Jesse. You said during your answer to the first Ukraine question that the United States and the NATO allies have refused to recognize the annexation of Crimea, but you seem to hint that it was a done deal. It's finished, and nothing is to be gained by trying to claw it back into Kiev's sphere or anything like that. Now, what type of aid has NATO provided to Ukraine, and shouldn't it have been considerably more robust, or do you think it's about right?
I go back and forth on this in my heart. I would say that the most important thing that the West did was not military aid. The most important thing that happened was quick IMF backing. So the IMF is the International Monetary Fund, and essentially in response to Crimea, there were many billions of dollars on paper pledged to support the future Ukrainian government. These are long-term loans that have an expectation of repayment by an entity that we call the Ukrainian government. And that support, the idea that there is a large, financially lubricated international system out there that is going to make sure that there's not a massive sell-off of property in Kiev, was very, very important. And I think as important as any bullets that we sent, the larger we. Since then, there have been debates that have taken place about what the appropriate kind of response is. And I have to say, I would worry, if I were Ukrainian, about escalation. Like if you want to wind the clock back and think about, what a more muscular response might have looked like, you can't just view it in a vacuum. You have to say, well, what would Russia's response have been to a more muscular response? And so I know that those were the debates that motivated the Obama administration to be very cautious in sending anti-tank missiles, for instance. But those missiles have gradually made their way, the weapon systems that the Ukrainians need to hit the weak point on the top of a tank have made their way there. And the map has not moved very much. The separatist territories have not been able to expand their oil spot into Ukraine proper, as some people feared that they would. So, to answer your question, if you put me on the spot, I do worry about limiting Western liability over outcomes in Ukraine. Anytime you're sending hardware, you worry a little bit about what the response will be to the hardware. Now, we are training a lot of their infantry, and so that is another thing that we're doing, is that the U.S. support to help stiffen the backs of the essentially light infantry recruits and to train trainers so that Ukrainians can train up their own military. That's been ongoing and well documented and totally public.
Something you said earlier is that it's sort of woke me up a little bit about when you talk about bringing in the United Nations, what you're talking about is bringing in the Russian army as peacekeepers.
Yeah.
Do you see in the next 5 years the parties, NATO talking to Russia, talking to the various parties in the separatist region and stopping this terrible thing? It's a mess.
Yeah, it would be good if they could. I have to say that that's my advocacy. And I think that the best way to cauterize it in my vision, would be a UN resolution that essentially sequences the things that people have agreed to do in the Minsk II Accords, with elections with OSCE monitors, and then security guarantees that are provided by Russia and France. So you keep the United States out of it, but you turn parts of the Donbass over to Russians and other parts of the Donbass over to France, which is it's kind of a NATO member with an asterisk. It's the NATO member that wasn't really excited about the US going into Iraq in 2003, for instance. There's a strong tradition of an independent foreign policy. And this would make it clear that symbolically there was a handoff of certain responsibility to Europe. You know, that this is an intra-European condominium over the future of Ukraine. I think that if it is Americans in the Donbass, I worry that would be a propaganda victory for Russia, to be honest with you. I worry that it would play too well into the narrative of America coming to get us. And so I think France would be the optimal actor on behalf of NATO. And I think that really the OSCE is the optimal actor in general, because it's an international, for those of you who don't know, the OSCE is called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And it is a security organization that, similar to NATO, it's a consensus organization, so every member has a veto. But unlike NATO, Russia is a member. And so it's been a compromise actor in all of this, because it's actually hard to find anything that Ukraine's a member too. It's hard to find anything that Ukraine and Russia and France and the United States and Great Britain all agree on here. But when that finally comes, I think the OSCE will be the implementing arm.
Okay. Russia has shown a couple of times that it's got a military option intervention in the former Soviet socialist republics, and it has used it, but not overwhelmingly. And you said that there has been a relatively low level of violence in the region in general. What tools of economic tools, foreign policy tools, does Russia have that are not military?
They have a lot of oil, so their ability to buy soccer teams and to use economic diplomacy is we call it corruption, but that's obviously one tool. Everyone who has paid any attention to American politics knows that there's something about misinformation, disinformation, the ability to manipulate news stories. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you should turn on the TV. That's another source of influence. A third source of influence is most people don't take it seriously, but the people who do take it seriously take it extremely seriously. Is clandestine, let's call it black ops and dark arts. So the idea that Russia actually is the kind of state where opposition members disappear or are poisoned, or these are people who have very long memories and make lists that you can't get off of. Even if that is only a myth, it's a myth that does deter certain people from writing or saying a certain thing, and that's kind of a spooky power. Let's say let's leave it at that. Russian soft power, I think, is very weak, and I think that was one of the things that was revealed in Ukraine that surprised Russia, is that despite the fact that a lot of people in East Ukraine send their kids to school in Russia and seem to root for the Ukraine, that a lot of people in East Ukraine seem to root for the Russian hockey team, or wear Russia jerseys, or vote for Russian parties that are about the Russian language, or members of the Russian Orthodox Church, or I could go on and on and on. These things that we think about as Russia exporting its soft power, when push came to shove, most of those people today call it an invasion and have clearly had no desire to be part of Putin's political project. So I think Russian soft power has been outed as being almost comically weak, even in the parts of the world where people thought that it would be strong. And if you compare America's ability to export its ideas and its values around the world, I mean, I think we just have a dominant comparative advantage in that. So I mean, there's nothing like the Marvel movie franchise that has come out of Russia. I mean, there's nothing. There was never a Soviet Elvis. I mean, we're just better at this stuff than they have ever been. So,
Okay.
gas and oil, and of course, the final thing would be nuclear weapons, which is different, I think, than normal military power because it sort of sits in the background of all of these conversations, and it's most effective in the background.
Okay, we have 5 minutes to resolve the Belarus situation.
That's all the time we need, I'm sure.
You said you'd like to answer. The latest drama on the Russian front periphery is Belarus, where strongman Alexander Lukashenko, president and dictator for life for the last 26 years, he just had a secret inauguration yesterday after a really dicey election. People are still going out in the streets after quite a bit of brutality from the police. Up to 200,000 show up on a given weekend to protest. What options do you think Russia has in resolving this crisis? And it is, we have to note, in a fundamentally a pro-Russian republic. The people feel Russian in many respects. They're considered to be, friends of Russia. The Lukashenko has been an ally, but last month he accused Russia of interfering, fomenting trouble in Kiev to push the elections in the opposite direction, I guess. How is this going to end? Are they capable of negotiating some sort of a peaceful post-Lukashenko scenario, or how do you see this unfolding?
This is the easy thing to say is the most responsible thing for a political scientist to say, which is I don't know. And I'm not really qualified as someone who doesn't know very much about Belarus to make sweeping claims. I will say that I have been very impressed by the presence of Tikhonovskaya. Svetlana Tikhonovskaya, for those of you who don't know, is the woman who believes that she won the election, and that all these 200,000 protesters are arguing to seat her. If you're interested in knowing what I'm talking about, just 2 days ago on the New York Times, they had an 11-minute video where she explains why her husband went to prison, why she ran, why she believes she won, why she ran, and why, how she has tried to articulate what would happen if she were seated. She doesn't have anything up her sleeve. And so I think that makes it a terribly difficult political problem for Vladimir Putin, or for really anyone else. It's very difficult to cast her as being a CIA plant or anything like that. She's obviously an authentic representative of a bottom-up grassroots desire for change within Belarus. And that is, yes, her voice is being amplified by the New York Times and by, European diplomats. But this is a bottom-up call for change. And the kinds of things that she's asking for, like OSCE election monitors and investigations into human rights abuses, this is Helsinki Accord stuff. So I think that if I were trying to think about what Russia's options here are, I don't think Russia, if you're thinking about Vladimir Putin and his legacy, I think he's very cautious and conservative about the prospect of Russia being responsible for murdering large numbers of Russian speakers or self-identified Russians. And so the pro-Russianness of the Belarusian population, if he can get it for free, of course he wants it. Just like if he could get Crimea for free, of course he wants it. But if it is a prospect of tainting his legacy by having to repress Russian speakers or self-identified Russians living in Belarus, I think that's a much more dangerous thing for his regime, and I would think that he would want to avoid it. There's a number of different softer options, but I don't think that we in the West would find out about those options until weeks or years later.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Jesse. I don't know if the rest of the people who were watching were as fascinated as I am by the topics and the way things are playing out in such an exciting and crazy way. Let's get back to Erin.
Hi. Well, I would like to thank you guys for such a fascinating conversation. So I have a question for you.
Sure.
You said, Jesse, you said this is just about you professionally now. Like, what you're doing right now, with teaching via Zoom, is that for your whole? Is that for the whole semester? Do you guys go semesters?
Yeah.
Trimesters?
So I'm happy to talk about this. We're on quarters in the UC system,
Okay.
and so. We have started up. It's called Return to Learn, and the earnest hope is that we won't have to shut down. But our hands are tied by the governor in the state of California. If there are too many cases by county, then everything in the county, including, as I understand it, the campus will decamp to only Zoom. But I have basically been teaching classes on Zoom from above my garage, and that's just been the situation. So it's shortened my commute, and I think everyone has been surprised at how well things have gone. If I actually trust the information that I'm getting from student surveys and satisfaction surveys of various kinds. It's not perfect and it's not as good as face-to-face, but it's, I work with a lot of professionals in the University of California system, and if there are any parents out there or, grandparents or anyone who's listening, you just need to know how much effort has gone into trying to make the educational experience as good as possible for the kids, because this is formative for them, and it's we're trying to make it first best and not second best.
Well, I'm glad you said that. I wrote a post for the members maybe like 2 weeks ago, and I wrote from a parent's perspective of having a full-time job, a part-time job, and also helping my kids remote learn. And I thought it would be interesting for everyone to hear from a teacher's perspective what it's like as also a parent. It's goofy sometimes. I was talking to someone on the phone earlier today. I was talking to a member on the phone, and I think something crazy happened in the house. I just go, I have to put my phone down right now. And I just had to go run, take care of it.
Well, there are a couple things that help me in this situation, and I'm happy to talk about this at length, but I'm sensitive to our time, so I'll just say two things quickly. First, I have the best students in the world, but they're mostly adults. So it's a different pedagogical experience when you're dealing with 31-year-olds who have spent time in war zones and who themselves have kids. than if you're dealing in terms of pedagogy with 20-year-olds or the people who are teaching high school or teaching 16-year-olds. All of that's different than teaching elementary school. So I think different teachers adapt to different constraints. And most people who are professional educators, like my parents were career elementary school teachers. And my dad doesn't think I even work. Like when I describe to him my teaching, he's just like, what, 6 hours a week, man, that's not teaching, right? And so that there's like an apples and oranges thing. And, and I have it really, really good. I'll be the first to say it. The other thing, though, that is important is that because of the time zone difference, I can teach once my kids are asleep, which is huge. That a class that starts at 6:30 Pacific time and goes until 9:30 Pacific time in Oak Park starts at 8:30 at night and goes until 11:30.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Max and Eleanor are down.
I'm sorry, is your son's name Max?
Yeah.
My son's name is Max.
Oh, you have excellent taste.
As do you. Mine are Max and Alice. Duana just has a statement. There's no question. She says, this has been the best information so far on the real world. So I guess I have one more question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Duana. I have one more question, and then I'm going to see if anybody else has one. I think there's a lot of frustration going on right now, and you touched upon it briefly in your conversation with Brian about, and then this is what Duana just said, that best information is it has to be frustrating for you as an academic and frustrating for Brian with your history to have so much misinformation out right now.
Yeah.
And I guess what advice do you give your students when pushing them to find the truth in the best way that they can?
God, that's a hard question and a really good one, but a really hard one because almost any answer that a professor gives in the current political environment gets accused of being propaganda for liberals, right?
Sure.
And so it's not enough to say, I just wish more people read the news, because there's a dominant narrative that higher education and the news have been captured by the left, and that's tough, right? So I will say that there's no substitute for reading newspapers and actually holding a newspaper and reading it, because you can assess the bias in a more mature way when you are confronted with the advertisements that are co-branded with the news articles that you're reading. And I read the Wall Street Journal, and I can't read the op-ed page, it's too biased, but for the actual news, my wife and I subscribe to the print Wall Street Journal, and that's how I educate myself. And it's so tempting to allow yourself to be infotained by a number of other things. But my wife and I cut the cord. We don't even have cable television. Like the only thing we do, we're going to subscribe to the Disney Channel so that we can introduce our kids to to shows, and I want to watch Star Wars and stuff.
And Hamilton.
But that's a compromise, right? And I never watch the news. My dad lives for the stuff though, so he asked me the same question about how you get news that's not misinformation or that's not terribly biased. And I have to say it's a question that has a lot of trapdoors. Brian, what do you think?
I get my television news from PBS. It's got a great hour program every evening, and then a good hour on Chicago, and that's where I sort of get my feed from that. And I read the Tribune and the Economist.
Yeah, the Economist is British conservatives. You know what you're getting. I love the Economist. I like NPR too. I mean, I'm one of those.
Say NPR. So. NPR and PBS just seem like just the stalwarts of.
Listen, we're in Oak Park, right? It's okay to say that we all listen to NPR.
Yes. On my drive.
That's who we are.
Ways.
All right.
Okay, so this is a selective, you can answer this question or not. I am going to bring, because this might be a thing where you're like, I don't, this is not my format, but I'm going to bring on Bonnie. Hi.
Hello. Hi, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your informative talk. Like Erin said, I don't know if this is appropriate, but in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of things on the news about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and business dealings being on the board of a Ukrainian company. Can you speak to that? Is this normal? Is this ethical? Is it something we should be concerned about, or is it much ado about nothing?
So I happen to have read about this just today in the Wall Street Journal, and so if we leave if we leave it to the professionals, there has been a report recently filed that suggests that some of what took place was probably a little bit shady and undermines U.S. efforts at anti-corruption in Ukraine, and that is so that suggests to me that there is a bit of a there if you're listening for it, and I'm amplifying that story. That's not the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal, by the way. That's the news part of the Wall Street Journal. That's the on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a kind of a pot calling the kettle black thing here. If we're going to talk about family members profiting from political connections in this particular election with this particular pair of candidates. And I actually think it's absurd on face.
Thank you. You might know this guy since he said some good things about you. Al Parcham. Why don't you ask your question?
Jesse, it's we have these books that you've written and you're working on another one. I'm wondering, do you have a sense of where your longer term research interest is trending?
Yeah, I do. Thanks for asking. And I think this is maybe as good of a place to wrap up as any. I know that people's time is valuable, and you all have better things to do. But I've been really interested in political violence for my entire adult life. And I mean, the main lineage that connects the projects that I've done, I didn't really talk about all of them, but I came to the canon of political science and became a political scientist because I thought that it really had the best diversity of important things to say about violence. And it's been 20 years that I've been working on that, and I don't think I'm going to do it very much anymore. I think that my next project's probably going to be about Turkmenistan, which is a country that is notable for the absence of violence. It's one of the many places that has managed, despite really horrific, terrible governance. This is a country that still won't admit that COVID exists, right? It's as closed as North Korea. It had a leader that misruled the country in a lot of ways, but it has been, when that leader died, it didn't break into a civil war. And so it's an orderly place that has, by nature of that, a lot of other things to study. I'm finding myself more interested in legislative politics. The future of Ukraine is, like, the violence is the least interesting thing going on in Ukraine right now. There are so many other things going on in Ukraine. And I recognize that a younger version of myself, you wouldn't be able to keep me out of the Donbass, right? Like when the shooting started, I would have been out there with a flak jacket. And I recognized that when I was in Ukraine, I barely even wanted to talk to these people because I had talked to so many versions of these people earlier. So I think I'm going to probably do less work on violence in the future. And if you lock me into a proper noun, it will probably be Turkmenistan.
Awesome. Well, that does sound like a good place to wrap up. So I'm going to say thank you so much to Brian and Jesse. You guys were so fascinating and again, so informative and very engaging.
Thanks to Al and Bonnie and you, Aaron, for asking questions. And thanks to Al for putting this together.
Oh, of course. And now when you pass Jesse on the street on Lake Street, if you live in Oak Park, you can say, "Hey, neighbor," and he'll give you a wave. So I'm gonna say good night to you too. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for attending tonight's inaugural Notable Neighbors. Hopefully you enjoyed it and learned something. If you want to see more programs like this, like Al said, you can nominate another neighbor that is notable. You can also give us a donation, and that will allow us to do many more programs and many more events. So thanks again to everyone for being here. Have a wonderful evening. Again, this is Erin Payton with the 19th Century Charitable Association, and good night.